My guests today are two fine gentlemen who invited me onto their podcast, The Divide, and we had a conversation about the second coming of Jesus and how I think it didn't happen. So today I'd like to welcome the two hosts of The Divide, Drew the Skeptic and Bill the Christian, which is I guess how they introduce themselves online. So welcome, guys, to the Deep Drinks podcast.
Thank you.
Thanks, David.
Well, I wanted to quickly give an introduction about who you guys are, but I thought it's best for you guys to just describe who you guys are. So could you just take a couple minutes to describe who you are and how you started the podcast? And I know, Bill, you have actually a background in Greek or in the classics. So if you could just touch on the relevant fields, that'd be great.
Yeah, I studied classics, so classical languages, which is always bad when you have to explain what it is you studied after you give the name of it. But what that means is not that I studied Mark Twain, but that I studied the Greeks and Romans and the languages of Greek, Latin, and Hebrew as well. And but that does not mean I'm some great scholar of these things. But yes, I did study them, and I teach classics and have taught for many years, but not so much Bible. And I was an atheist growing up, and then converted to Christianity in university.
And just take all that, and I'm pretty much the opposite. So grew up Christian, grew up in the church, have since, started, well, it's been almost a lifelong process of skepticism creeping in. But I majored in finance, and I'm more of an armchair philosopher. So Bill is definitely the fact checker on our podcast. And I just bring a lot of questions and just interest. I've always been interested in philosophy and in religion and the big questions, and so that's pretty much what we do. We usually have one guest, either a Christian or an atheist, or sometimes even someone. We've had Muslims, rabbis, people of other religions as well, and we've had all different kinds of atheists and skeptics, I guess. So we just typically have a conversation much like the one we're about to have, I guess.
Yeah, for sure. And so your podcast is called The Divide, and the link is in the description. You guys can check it out. You guys, a lot of great episodes, and this is actually a part 2 of an episode that we have done. So if you haven't watched part 1 first, go check out part 1 because you might be a bit lost. But this is like kind of a continuation on the kind of questions that we were talking about on that podcast. So lastly, what are we drinking today? We're all drinking something different. For me, it's 9 a.m., so I've got myself a coffee. Bill, you got yourself a coffee as well?
Got the flat white in honor of the Australians.
Okay.
Nice.
Well, it is 5 o'clock somewhere in the world. In fact, here in Nashville, this is a home style. It's a type of beer that is made locally here by a brewery called Bearded Iris. So if you're ever in Nashville, check them out. They do some good work.
Oh, nice. What type of beer is it, if you don't mind me asking?
It's an IPA. It's actually most of their IPAs are the unfiltered type or hazy. This one's just their kind of flagship. So it's kind of mild, but they do some flavorful stuff.
2 types of people in the world, Drew. Those that drink IPAs and the smart people.
Oh, didn't think it was going to go down that way, Bill. That's tough.
Drew and I are good friends, so I'm just rubbing it.
Yeah. Actually, I wanted to ask you guys before we jump into the topic: what are some of have you guys had any like really heated conversations? Heated in a good way. I don't mean like you end up throwing hands at the end of it, but like, what are some great conversations that you guys have had that you've really like bumped heads on and like kind of wrestled it out on the podcast?
Oh man, I'd have to think about that.
I don't know that I don't know that we've ever had like a heated discussion or anything like that.
I thought our first, part 1 of this got pretty intense. I mean, hopefully we'll
true.
We'll find all the answers this time. But
yeah, that's true. Yeah. Well, I mean, heated, I suppose can be interpreted differently. But yeah, I mean, we've talked about everything for so many years, and there's always been a really good friendship between us, and so I think we've gone all around. But we also really like to follow as far as we can know and as far as we can think, sort of, and are pretty give each other a lot of space, to give each other's opinions and try and work with them. And sometimes when I'm working on, Drew and I occasionally will counsel one another on how to deal with our respective communities.
That's right. We can usually predict what the other one is going to say
Yes.
because we've been on both sides of the argument.
That's amazing.
And also, Bill makes a very good point. Typically he'll be the one telling the Christians, since he is one of them, hey, maybe don't go down that road of argument, because you're going to get shut down, or he just tends to rein in the as I would call it, the crazy. I try to do that for the skeptic side too. I know there's a lot of bad arguments out there on my side of the coin.
Oh yeah, there's definitely you go from the frying pan into the fire. What they say, it's just there's chaos on either side of every perspective. So last time we spoke about the second coming of Jesus, and I guess it kind of started because I did an episode on Myth Vision where I talked about how, for me, I think it's blatantly obvious that Matthew, Luke, and Mark, Jesus is talking to his disciples, and he mentions that the second coming of Jesus and a bunch of other things are going to happen within a generation. And we kind of had a back and forth on that. What I have done is I've been learning a bit of animation for a documentary that I'm working on with Deep Drinks. And so I thought it'd be a great opportunity to I've been testing out some of my animation skills on for YouTube Shorts. So I actually created a YouTube short on this very subject. It's very clickbaity, so you have to forgive me for that. And it's very provocative in a way, like I make it. I'm trying to spark conversation in the description, but it gives a good overview of my position. So I think I'll just show that and let me know if you guys can hear it. Jesus was supposed to have returned by approximately 60 CE. Well, that's at least what he told his disciples. In Matthew, we find Jesus warning his disciples about future events. Wars, earthquakes, famines, false prophets, the sun and the moon will be darkened, stars will fall from the sky. Then bam, just as things are falling apart, Jesus returns on the clouds with an army of angels at the sound of a loud trumpet call. When the disciples asked him, when will this happen? Jesus tells them, truly I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. The same story is repeated 2 more times in Mark and Luke. This is huge because if Jesus is telling the truth, he should have returned 2,000 years ago. Did you know Jesus? Yeah, so I guess that's a great place to start because that's, I guess, my perspective. I don't know, Drew, how you feel about that, if you're on the same kind of page. And Bill, as a Christian, last time we had this conversation, you definitely disagreed with that perspective. So I guess let's go around. Well, Drew first, I guess, what do you think about that? Are you in agreement with that in general?
Yeah. So without completely summarizing last time, this is a good way to sort of like just pick up where we left off. I think I was kind of, my perspective when we were talking about this before was that I for the most part agree that my understanding is this is kind of where historical Jesus scholarship has come down, that he was an apocalyptic preacher who thought that he was predicting, or that he was warning, repent, the end is near. And this reading of this text would be part of that from a historical perspective. I know obviously it's not going to be the Christian perspective because Jesus can't be wrong, right? So this to me is sort of an unsurprising conclusion historically, but very surprising, or it would have been very surprising to me as a Christian growing up. But I do think that what he meant was a generation, and he meant 40 years. He meant the end, the culmination of God's plan with him leading the charge. And so I don't think that any of these things were talking about other events that were also big cataclysmic things like the temple and being destroyed or whatever. And I'm open to changing my mind on any of that because I'm certainly not a historian, but I think that the scholarship, as I understand it, is in line with that. And
this is funny because me, Drew, and myself, we just have to point to scholarship. We're like, like, this is what scholarship says. And I'm waiting for Bill to come in and be like, well, in the Greek, it said so.
The scholars, are just looking at grains of sand, right? So most scholars aren't looking at everything; they're looking at very, very tiny things. So they have to invoke the other scholars who are doing the work in that particular area. So really, I guess it really doesn't matter much whether.
Well, and luckily they all disagree, so this won't be a short podcast.
Exactly. I was just going to say that when I was in university, my advisor was sat on the Jesus seminar, which was very famous in previous decades, I'll say, and their view that the more common view among the Jesus seminar people, and certainly among my advisor, was not quite the Jewish apocalyptic prophet view. Even though that's probably the majority sort of scholarship view, I agree, but it was not in that group, and it wasn't the sort of the exposure I had myself when I was studying. Even though I was in classics, I had an advisor who was a New Testament expert, and a very good one. But their view tended to be more what's called I guess I'll just say the Jean Dominic Crossan view, which is sort of like if you think of how you get to the Jewish apocalyptic prophet view, right, is you go away from just all the gospels as if they have equal value, every story is equal value, and you go into what's the first gospel, the earliest gospel, Mark, or any other sources we can demonstrate that probably are behind the gospels, like Q or M or L, if you're familiar with those. And then we look at that bottom layer. But what Crossan and these guys did is they were like, yeah, but even Q has layers. And you go to the earliest layers of the earliest layers, and then you find out Jesus just loved everybody.
Down the rabbit hole.
I do want to ask what you think, Bill, but it reminds me of Dr. Matt Munger was coming on, and he was saying that he lives in, oh my gosh, I'm forgetting where he lives. Oslo. Where's Oslo? It's Norway?
As in Norway.
Yeah, Norway. I should know that. I'm doing a whole... Anyway.
I'm Norwegian. That's how I know.
Oh, okay. There we go. So he was saying that if I came to there and everyone was speaking Norwegian, and he could interpret for me. He could tell me what was being said, but he wouldn't be translating. He'd be interpreting. So, like, say we're sitting in a room and someone's speaking, and he's just like whispering in my ear. Oh, they're saying this, they're saying this, they're saying this. It's different from translating, it's interpreting. And because the gospel traditions were oral traditions, at least first, because they weren't written for so long, and then written in a different language, he makes the argument that essentially it's interpretation. It's not necessarily translation, because we don't have like gospels in Aramaic or anything like that. So I could see an argument being made that maybe the original oral tradition was translated wrong and the word generation shouldn't be in there at all. But then you're dealing with like the inherency of scripture, and scripture, I forgot what it is, but where the word is the perfect word of God and everything. But before we jump into all that, Bill,
all
what are your
scripture
thoughts?
Is God breathed and useful for teaching? As scripture refers to itself.
Yeah, but then you go like, well, at the time, what was scripture? Because that's the perspective I used to hold. Yeah, sure. But Bill, you've actually responded in an email with a large kind of your position. That's kind of a bit of a large.
Yeah, I tried to give a little bullet point just to you guys so you could have something to think about ahead of time. And first of all, I do think it's really good always to see these kind of minutia questions in a larger context, which you already have done, which is that you have this kind of probably the dominant scholarly view is the Albert Schweitzer view, which if you were to buy a Bart Ehrman book, you would more or less get that view. And that is a really common view, probably the majority opinion. Even in the Christian world, where you have like scholars like N.T. Wright, who are more on the conservative evangelical side of the Christian scholarship, even someone like him would still agree with much of Albert Schweitzer's view. And even push against some aspects of the traditional Christian view. So it's not, and of course there's other Christian scholars like Dale Allison and stuff. So it's not, my point is it's really worth the conversation for everybody, kind of regardless of their position. And these verses sort of play into which particular view someone adopts and why, and so on. But what I thought we sort of agreed on last time, or at least I agree with this, that if you just took this verse from Matthew 24, it's also in Mark, and it's in all the Olivet Discourse scenes. Amen, I say to you, this generation won't pass away till all things be accomplished. That if you just look at that verse seen on a page all by itself, it plainly means that Jesus is saying before his contemporaries die, these things are going to happen. I mean, that's just sort of like obvious what that means if you just looked at it. But what I tried to say last time is there are times where the Bible, if you just take a verse out, people look at it, they think they know what it means. I wouldn't say this is really common, but it's certainly not unheard of. Like he who's without sin, let him cast the first stone. People quote this verse all the time. They think it's obvious what it means. But actually, if you go read the story, it's not the way most people, the meaning of it is not quite the way they understand it. So I would say only that you have to at least check when you see something you think the meaning is plain, you have to at least check to make sure, hey, if I started Matthew from the beginning of the book and read the whole gospel and I got to Matthew 24, would I still think this is the plain meaning? And my argument would be no. I don't think someone would if they did that. And what I think I sent this was that I said, if you take, say, the first English editions of the Bible, right? English translation is very stubborn. The translations have been very stubborn. People usually don't like big changes. So if you go back to the Wycliffe version and you look up in that Bible and read it, Matthew 24 is going to say basically what you're used to seeing. But if you read his whole, the team of the Wycliffe translators basically that did that, and you read other passages in that translation, it would be really clear that the word generation doesn't quite always mean what meaning we give to it. We assume in our world, like if you're not in my generation, it means you're not a part of the contemporaries I grew up with, right? It has a very narrow sort of obvious meaning. And so we just assume that's what Matthew must be talking about. But in Wycliffe's translation, Jacob is instructed to go back to from Syria to quote his generation, end quote. But it's not talking about him going to his contemporaries like some that it clearly just means to go back to his family who are down south. And anyone could read that and see that's the plain meaning in Genesis, that the word generation clearly just means his family. The problem is we don't have that meaning anymore. The word generation, if you look it up in the dictionary, no longer carries both of those meanings. It used to be able to mean family. It could also mean your contemporaries. It had just two different connotations, and it would depend on the context that would decide which meaning you have. So that would just be an example where, again, you think something just plainly means what it says, but actually in the English Bible translation tradition, it doesn't always plainly mean that. Sometimes you have to actually look at the context and make a decision of what the word means. And so I think I touched on briefly the last time we talked that the word yeneah, which is this word here, yeneah, it's like our word generation. It's similar with a G. It starts with a G. Geneah, I guess you would say. So this word in Greek, okay, this much I can say very, very confidently because I've been doing a lot of Greek for a few decades now. This word is like the word generation used to be, in the sense that sometimes it means your contemporaries. Other times its connotation is that it refers to someone's family, or more broad. It can even be broader than that. In fact, the word originally just meant birth, and then it came to mean not only the act of birth, the act of generating something, but it could also mean the thing generated, the offspring, the child. And then later it got used chronometrically. So you could use births to mark out periods of history. So like at the beginning of Matthew, it talks about 14 births. In Greek, you would hear the idea births. There's 14 births from Abraham to David. So it's clearly being used with a temporal meaning, right? 14, what we call generations. But it's just to a Greek, to hear the word, it's just the word genea. Genea is how I would pronounce it. So genea. And you would have to decide in the context what exactly it means there. And just to give you a simple example in English of how this works, okay? Think of the word family. If we say, hey, we've decided that that our family is going to all watch the Super Bowl together this Sunday. We've called Grandpa and Grandma, and we're all going to get together and watch the Super Bowl together, and we're going to eat chili. You would know in that context that the word family means a bunch of people who are born of the same ancestry or whatever, who are all living at the same time. Like that's implied in the use of the word family in that sentence, that everybody is living at the same time. And it would be just intuitive. You would just know that's what it means. But if somebody said, our family has suffered great tragedies ever since we arrived in this country in the late 1800s. Well, if you said that sentence, which is perfectly normal English, you would immediately know that now the word family isn't just a bunch of people who are living at the same time, who are blood related, but they're blood related across a very long period of time with multiple generations, some of whom are no longer living. So I would say, just as the word family gets used with those different connotations and you intuit the meaning, I think that's what the word does in Greek. So when you're reading, if you were reading Josephus, okay, the vast majority of time that Josephus uses this word, he does not use it with the temporal connotation. He doesn't use it to mean like a group of contemporaries. Okay, he uses it to mean simply. By the way, when it is being used of contemporaries, it still implies that they're born of the same stock. So it's more like a family who's all got the same parent who are living at the same time. That's what the word means. Which is a little bit different from the way we use the word generation, where our generation doesn't have to be all like have the same parent or great grandparent. So that's different because in Greek it does have to have the same parent in order for you to use the word. So anyway, so Josephus uses it. He's a contemporary of the gospel writers. He rarely uses it to mean generation in the sense of group of contemporaries. Okay, and you could just anybody could go do their own research and look that up if they wanted to. When Justin Martyr uses the word, he's an early church father, and he's talking about one of the passages in Matthew. By the way, he's mid-2nd century, if you want to date him. Okay, so he's talking about in a dialogue with Trypho, who's a Jew, he uses this word in relation to a verse in Matthew chapter 12, where it talks about this genea, this generation. And he uses it again, atemporally. He doesn't use it in the sense of a group of people who are all living at the same time. He says, Trypho, these are your genea, the people back in Matthew 12. But of course, he's 100 years removed from those people. But he's telling Trypho, they're your people, is what he means. But he uses the word genea, and yet they're clearly it's not. So all that is just to say, at a linguistic level, the word doesn't settle it. It could be this, it could be that. And so we have to go in and look at sort of how is the word used in Matthew. And the majority of scholars who have commented on the passage in commentaries or have translated it, I would say the majority of them read the references in the Synoptic Gospels to this word as implying the contemporaries of Jesus. Right? That's why you get so many of the English translations, even though there's some footnotes that sometimes will tell you it can mean something else. But generally, that's what you're going to see, and that is the more common view. Now, I would also say, you can check me on this, you rarely will find anyone to provide an argument for that. They just kind of declare it. Okay, and that's fine. Maybe they're right, but you have to provide an argument for that to make the case if you're going to take that position. And particularly since Justin Martyr, who was one of the earliest church fathers, didn't read it that way. So you kind of have to at least do your homework and make sure you're reading it correctly. And
this passage specifically, or just the word?
He referred to the reference in Matthew 12 where it says, this generation, the judgment will be more tolerable for like Nineveh than for this generation. He's referencing that passage where it uses the same expression, this generation, this genea, but he uses it atemporally, not to refer to the contemporaries. Now, what you have to do then, so this is just my suggestion, and then you can, I would tell you what I would do from here, is I would say, okay, well, let's start with Matthew and let's kind of go through and see, like, how is the word used, what does it mean, and so on. And we're not going to sit and go through the whole book, but I would reference just two passages that really influence me in the way I read it. The first is in Matthew 17, where it's right after the Mount of Transfiguration, and Jesus, comes down from the mountain, and there's the father who has a son who seems, sort of epileptic. He has seizures and stuff, but he's possessed with a demon. And Jesus, the father tells him that his disciples, Jesus' disciples, couldn't cast out the demon. And so Jesus makes a comment. He says that this genea is twisted and faithless. But in doing that, he's actually quoting a line from Deuteronomy 32. That's an expression in Deuteronomy 32, which is the famous last comments from Moses to Israel right before they entered into the promised land and right before he died. And if you go back and read Deuteronomy 32, where this language is used of genea, it's the same word in the Greek. The Hebrew word is door. But anyway, there it seems really clear that the word is being used of multiple generations of Israelites. It's just referring to the whole family of the Israelites and their persistent rebellion across multiple generations. So if Deuteronomy 32 is being referred to, then it would seem like Jesus is using his understanding of this language is coming out of Deuteronomy 32, not just from, say, Greek grammar or whatever, or Hebrew grammar. It's coming out of actually a passage. And that passage does not use the word temporally. It's using it of Israel across multiple generations. Then you have the issue of Matthew 23. Now, Matthew 23 is a little different in that you've got the passage that actually triggers our story. Matthew 24 is a long sermon or discourse. They call it the Olivet Discourse, and it's a response to the disciples' questions. But why were the disciples even asking these questions? Because of what is talked about in Matthew 23, it leads into their questions. Okay, so in other words, you can't separate Matthew 23 and 24. And in Matthew 23, you have what to me seems the most helpful of all the discussions about this word, because Jesus talks about how the judgment is going to fall upon this genea. But then he also says it will fall upon you. And when he explains, this is, if you're wondering what the passage is, it's Matthew 23, verses 30, around verse 33 or so into verse 36. If you, I don't know if you guys have a text or something, you can look at it, but it's Matthew 23 and verse 35 is the key verse here, where Jesus says, the reason that the judgment is going to fall upon you. Now, he's just denounced Pharisees. Oh, this is perfect. Great. So it's very small print, but anyway, I'll just quote it.
I'll zoom in.
Yeah, it's fine. But you can see, yeah, very, very good. So you can see there in verse 35, where he's saying, it'll come upon all the righteous blood. The judgment's going to come upon you. The upon you is just a little bit earlier than there. And this is in, there you go. So that all the righteous blood will be shed on the earth, from the blood of Abel to the blood of Zechariah, son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. Amen, I say to you, all this will come on this genea. Now, here's what's interesting. where he says that this judgment will come upon you, upon this Genea, he says the reason is because you see that in verse 35, you murdered Zechariah. You see that line there? You don't have it highlighted, but you see that's right above that, whom you murdered. But clearly, Jesus' contemporaries did not murder Zechariah. He lived centuries before this time. So Jesus is talking to, quote, this Genea, saying that the judgment is going to fall upon this Genea, right? But you'll notice it says in verse 35 at the beginning, that's equated to upon you will come all the righteous blood. So upon you is the same as this Genea. And why is it? Well, it's because he's just said that he's going to send future apostles and prophets to them and they're going to kill them. But he says it's because you murdered Zechariah, but Zechariah lived centuries before. So I don't want to keep repeating it, but you can see in the context, he's not thinking of this Genea as just the people standing in front of him, because he's describing actions carried out by their ancestors hundreds of years prior to this. And yet he's saying, you did it. You did it. This Genea did it. Well,
so
see, it doesn't seem like you could say there that it's strictly like his contemporaries. It doesn't work.
So putting the pieces together, then would the contention be that he was talking about the people of the Jews, the people of Israel?
Yes, whenever he's referring to their Genea in the Synoptic Gospels, it's always pejorative. It's always accompanied with some sort of epithet like wicked and
deceitful generation.
Yeah, twisted, wicked, adulterous, Genea, meaning the family of the brood. The brood of yeah.
Is this why people say Matthew is a bit anti-Semitic, or people think that that's a pejorative directed at the Jews themselves?
Yes, yeah, it is. And by the way, then, just for clarity, just the next thing he said in that passage is where he weeps over Jerusalem, and he says, how often I wanted to gather your children. You see how it's connected to Genea. Genea means offspring, family, nation. It can mean nation, but really it means the brood of whoever's born of a common stock. And like a hen gathers her brood under her wings, that's how I wanted to treat you, but you rejected me. And then the disciples, after that, because he pronounces, the judgment on the city, and then the disciples respond asking questions. So go ahead, you can respond to that, and then I have one or two other reasons why I think it doesn't work. The other reason, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to mention last time, if someone has been naughty and hasn't watched the first one, you mentioned that for you this is like, as a Christian, this is a big deal. You can't just kind of hand wave it away. It's like if a physicist discovered that the cosmic background radiation didn't exist or something. It's like, whoa, let's check the maths. It's important because there's a lot that like hinge on that one idea, that one concept. So it's very important. Where for Drew and I, we just go, whatever. But for a Christian, this is something that even if the scholarly consensus points in the overwhelming majority in one direction, it's like, well, like let's try and make this work. And I appreciate that you kind of said it like that.
Yeah, because that's the reality. A Christian is going to make a lot of effort. And of course, most of the there's many different ways Christians have explained this. And actually, a lot of ways are not ways I think are very persuasive. And a lot of them just assume the meaning of the word is Jesus' contemporaries and so on. And they have other ways of understanding it. The early church fathers had a very common way of understanding it. And I'm not convinced that that's the right way to read it, but they did have other ways to understand it. So it's not like if I'm wrong, it means, the whole faith crumbles per se. I just meant that it is the case that Christians believe that. By the way, critical scholars, just to be clear, they have a lot invested in the sort of Schweitzer view, right? That's the framework of the dominant, or the majority, I should say, view of a lot of scholars. And those scholars who hold that view, not all scholars do, those scholars who hold that view, I would say they also, this verse is very, very important to their view. There's a couple verses that seem very strongly in their favor. And I would just suggest that they might be inclined to fight a little bit too, knowing that it kind of threatens the whole framework they're working with, which is a kind of a different, from the traditional way of reading the Gospels historically within the church, So I do think there's times where it kind of seeps out that actually both sides are sort of fighting for their ground. I think for you and Drew, it's not, you're not like you haven't been publishing books of you.
No, yeah, so. Exactly. There's so something that we talked about, I'm getting to my question, but something that we talked about last time was I asked you, do you know any, this is a different line of questioning, but bear with me. Do you know any Bibles that translate the word generation differently, right? Or they translate it. And we both hadn't looked it up, but I looked it up. And so I actually found this website, it does it all. And every translation that's listed here, except for the Good News translation. Remember that all these things will happen before the people now living have all that. Okay. But they all say generation. And on this website anyway. And so I went down and I found this commentary, and I thought this was really interesting. This generation shall not pass. The natural meaning of the word is beyond question, that which takes generation in the ordinary sense. And for those living at any given period. So it was this generation that accumulated judgments were to fall. The desire to bring the word into a more apparent harmony with history has led to interpretations to take generation in the sense of race or people, and so to see the words a prophecy of the perpetuity of existence of the Jews as distinct people till the end of the world. But for this meaning there is not a shadow of authority, nor does it remove the difficulty which it was invented to explain. The words Matthew 16:28 state the same fact in languages which do not admit any such explanations. And that's by some old Bible scholar that was, a theologian or something, who's died 100 years ago or something. But I was like, wow, that is a very Hitchens kind of take on what I would say. But so my question is, after all this, is if the job, this is my understanding of a Bible translator, is that the Bible translator translating into English is to make it so it's easy to understand for an English reader. So if that word generation there means something different than how we read it in modern English, my question is, why don't any Bibles translate it differently? But my second question is, and this is the one I'm most interested in, is how would you translate the verse? This generation shall not pass away until all these things happen. How would you translate that for modern English as someone who knows Greek and can translate?
Yeah, probably in the context, I would say this people might be a nice way to do it in English. This people will not pass away until all things be accomplished.
And meaning Israel? Just to like completely new living this instead of just the people living the people alive right now, you would say
what's the message translation?
You would say all the Jewish people.
Yes. I like to be honest, I like the word brood, even though it's used in the chapter before of the hens, the chicks, but which is a different Greek word. But because brood to us conveys the idea of offspring, and the word genea means offspring, like it's literally from the verb to give birth. That's what the word comes from. Okay, like our word generate is related to generation. They have the idea of generation. So let me answer your questions as fast as I can, or as clear as I can. The first is
also that this is just me and Drew like trying to poke holes in.
No, it's good. It's good.
There's like a clear divide.
I can only just tell you how I see it. So the comment you just read would be like, to me, it's like, tell me you don't know what you're talking about, without telling me you don't know what you're talking about. So that comment that you read is embarrassing to this person, whoever wrote it.
Oh, well, Elliot's commentary. Okay.
Yeah. The classical Greek, in classical Greek, mind you, right? The word is never, and I mean there is zero record in any lexicon or anywhere of the word ever meaning what he just said it meant. In later Greek, Koine Greek is the Greek, of course, of the New Testament, you do see it start to come up like that as a singular reference to a group of contemporaries. But you don't have that in classical Greek. That's a later development. Okay, so first of all, I'll say that. Second, you'll see it in the plural, but not like a singular like that. Secondly, Chrysostom, who was obviously a native Greek speaker in the 4th century, when he comments on the word, he states specifically in Greek, of course, he's commenting in Greek on this verse. He says that that in Greek, of course, right? He doesn't say in Greek because he's commenting on his own language. He says this word can have a temporal connotation, or it can connote something that's not temporal, that's just related to, the family, quote, a group who are connected by something else, like offspring and so on. So he makes that comment when he's commenting on the passage, and he's a native speaker of the language at the time, or at least in the Roman Empire. So I think that's a sufficient authority, to somebody can go look up Chrysostom if they want and look at his commentary on Matthew. They can see he comments on the meaning of the word. So he doesn't say it has to mean this. He says it could mean one of the two things. So that's the first thing. The second thing. Now, there are translations whose footnotes will tell you it can mean something like race or nation, like the NIV, the NASB, at least editions I've seen, they do have that as footnotes, okay, where you can see that the word does have another meaning. And if you look at any commentary that's worth anything, a commentary by somebody who actually knows the language, they will tell you that, yes, the word could mean this. Now, I have to say, I looked in the last month at a few commentaries that I generally respect, and I was a little surprised how dismissive they were of what that the word could mean, family or offspring, something to that effect. And I will just only say, I offer you the challenge of finding somebody who actually defends that position and why they defend it, other than just declaring it. That's just honest. I'm just telling you honestly. So, but aside from that, hold on, just aside from that,
just to clarify, you're saying they're dismissing it. Your reading of the word, or your definition of the word in the context of this particular verse, right?
Of the synoptic gospels across the board, they'll say that the word always means contemporaries, and they more or less say, even Don Carson, I think, I shouldn't name names if I can't remember the person. So even someone who's conservative evangelical, I can't remember. It probably wasn't Don Carson. Let's just say that. They more or less said, it gets desperate if you try to say this word could mean this other thing. And honestly, I'm just like, you understand that New Testament scholars read New Testament Greek. They're not reading all of Greek, like Thucydides and Plato, and they're not always like reading all the Greek. So sometimes they make some comments that feel a little narrow to me. But anyway, I'm just telling you, anything I've said here, you can literally check every single thing I've said. You can check the Chrysostom reference. You can check Justin Martyr. You can check Josephus. I mean, how is it that Josephus, who's a contemporary writer, rarely uses the word in its temporal meaning of contemporaries? He mainly uses it to refer to the nation of Israel or offspring or a family. He uses it like that sometimes, but he refers to it in the sense of race. Yeah.
I still have an issue though with your reading of it, because if you say it's this people, it doesn't seem to be in the spirit of everything else Jesus is talking about. It doesn't seem that Jesus is saying this people as in 2,000 years from now. Like, it doesn't. I don't get that vibe from it. And like, even when I was reading,
maybe that's just a bad translation. I mean, the word means off. Yeah, the word means off. The word means offspring. Yeah.
Can I try to make this point too? I want to jump in, and I don't want it to. I don't want to subvert the cross-examination of the word, but like, I think what David was about to say, and what I've been thinking this whole time is, well, let's grant that Bill's interpretation is correct. Then what does the verse say? Is Jesus saying the Jewish people will not pass away until all these things have happened? If that's the case, it seems rather a silly thing to say. Like,
yeah, now I think we're making a lot more progress as far as I'm concerned. But so let's talk about that for a second. But I just want to close out again, generation and Wycliffe, right? You can go look at it yourself in Genesis 31 and see that the word means family. So it, however you want to
I
translate
love how you're taking on all like modern biblical scholarship
Right.
consensus here, and I'm not saying that as a pejorative. You know that I
Yeah.
believe in you, and I think that you're a really smart guy. I just think it's a it's bold. It's still bold.
But the thing that gets me about this is we're talking about generation as in like we're talking. Well, let's just the Jewish people. All this will happen as the Jewish people still stand. But the things that are described, and this is in Luke, but it's a little different. They'll hand you over to the synagogues. You'll be put in prison. You'll bear testimony to me. Do not worry beforehand.
So it's a lot of
When
stuff.
Jerusalem is surrounded by armies, you will know the desolation is near. Let those who are in Judea. It's not talking about like I'm not going to Judea. You know what I mean? What is it? It says Jerusalem will be trampled on by the Gentiles. There'll be signs there'll be signs for the sun, moon, and stars. It says somewhere here that people will fall by the sword. Where is that? Let me just. Sword. Yeah. They will fall by the sword and be taken prisoner to all nations. Like, wouldn't you say if this was, wouldn't you say they will be taken by AK-47s and prisoner to all? Like, why would you use like age specific terminology if then you're going to say at the end, by the way, this is all going to happen in the next at least 2,000 years? Like, that just seems very. It's hard for me to wrap my head around. It just seems very odd. It's a very weird thing. It's like Jesus saying, by the way, bad stuff can happen.
Yeah. Let me answer that one very quickly, but I don't want to get on the rabbit trail unless you want to come back to it. But I don't think Luke is referring to the same quite exact thing. If you look at the passage there, Luke is talking about the actual physical surrounding of the city of Jerusalem by Roman armies. And that after the Roman armies destroyed Jerusalem, time will move forward, he says, and I quote now, until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. So he's looking at an event that is in the ancient period back then, right? Yeah, there. And then there's a period following that where Gentiles will rule Jerusalem until those times are fulfilled. That I'm just telling you, that's what verse 24 is saying. Just on its face, it seems like that's what it's referring to. So I don't want to get lost on that because I want to come back to the other thing. We can eventually get back to this if you want to, but if we could just get back to the other thing, because Drew, I want to clarify, Drew.
Sorry.
Drew, I mean, look, I. Howard Marshall wrote, a very prestigious commentary on Luke in the Greek Testament commentary series. You can go look it up. I. Howard Marshall, and I. Howard Marshall makes the same case more or less that I'm doing. Not the same way, but he comes to the same conclusion. He uses some references from the Dead Sea Scrolls to show that this word in the Hebrew context of Jesus among first century Jews clearly was transgenerational. It didn't just refer to one group of contemporaries. And, he's hard, he was a prestigious scholar. I think he's passed away now. So it's not like it's just my secret view. There are scholars who held the view, Leon Morris and so on. There's other scholars who hold the view. But why the translation tradition sticks with generation, I would say, first of all, because a lot of these scholars think that's really what the word means, even in modern English. I think in some ways they're a little bit influenced by just the kind of stubbornness of translation that translators tend to try and change as little as possible, right? So they try to retain as much as possible from previous translations, and sometimes things get through the cracks a little bit. And others, I think they really do just think that's what the word means. By the way, in Luke 16:8, I didn't reference this at all. In Luke 16:8, nobody thinks the word genea means the contemporary, Jewish contemporaries. It cannot mean it in that verse. So almost everybody who comments on what they think the word means throughout the Gospels always says, well, except Luke 16:8. Well, okay, that's fine. That's fine. But, that means it doesn't always mean that. Okay. So you have to then decide on context. And I've tried to give an argument. my argument is really actually not the meaning of the word or even the translation. I'm trying to say if all you had was an English Bible and you saw the word generation in Matthew 23, and you saw Jesus talk about the generation, this generation in Matthew 23, it's clear he's using the term to describe the group of Jews across many, many centuries who have been rebelling against God now since the days of the prophets. And therefore, they're going to be judged imminently. Like, I agree, that's what he's saying. But I'm saying like in Matthew 23, it's not possible to make sense of that passage if he's just limiting the meaning of the word to his contemporaries, because his contemporaries weren't alive, hundreds of years before that, killing Zechariah. So even in an English Bible, I think you can still see that the meaning of the word is not limited to the contemporaries. And if you read Deuteronomy 32 in English, just go look at it in English. You don't need Greek or Hebrew. You can see Moses is referring to events across many generations of Jews, but he's using the term generation to describe them, the group who's doing these things. So I'm not trying to say you have to know Greek to do this. I'm saying if you just look at an English Bible and read the context, it can't really hold this meaning always that Jesus is referring to his contemporaries. Maybe sometimes it does refer to the contemporaries and other times it clearly doesn't. And the biggest one is Matthew 23, because it's what sets the context for the whole discussion in Matthew 24. It's in response to that. Now, if we go ahead.
I actually haven't heard that. That's actually something really interesting that I never heard before. And it's something to look at. I didn't know about, I didn't look at it in the context of Matthew 23. I'm just curious, and I don't know, but is that the same for Mark and Luke? Is it the same preamble?
No, Matthew has those denunciations of the Pharisees, and scribes right immediately before this passage, and then has Jesus announcing the destruction of the temple. Luke has moved that denunciation earlier in the gospel, as he does frequently move things around quite a bit. Mark does not have the passage at all. So, yeah.
Do you hold to Markian priority?
Yes, I do. But Mark does have the reference to Deuteronomy 32, where Jesus uses the languages out of Deuteronomy 32 of generation, but he's citing an allusion to Deuteronomy 32. So even if you just had Mark and not Matthew, I would still say Jesus's use of the word is clearly not always just his contemporaries. So you're going to have to decide by context in Mark, in the Olivet Discourse, what it means. So now let's get on to that, because that was, I think, your other really big question was if you're just reading the whole discourse. So I would just like to say in like 30 seconds, a very simple thing about that discourse that many people miss that can be really helpful. All right. The disciples ask two questions. They ask, when will all these things happen? And then they ask, what sign will there be to these things? And it doesn't matter whether you're in the Olivet Discourse in Matthew, Luke, or Mark, they all retain these two questions. Okay. Then Jesus answers them, and his answer falls into two parts. And the first part, he's responding to the question about signs. And that's where you get him telling them to beware of false signs. Don't think some of the things that are going to happen are actual signs of the end. They're not. There can be earthquakes and wars. There can be things that happen that are not actually, they're bad, but they're not the signs of the end. They're not the end, he says. The end is, quote, not yet. Okay. So he has to warn them about the danger of looking for signs because you think the end is here. So just in the context, you would say that means that from the writer's perspective, Christians needed to be reminded from Jesus not to expect always the end is upon them. That's the only function of those verses.
Do a lot of historians think that's an interpolation, or is
yes, but if you're in Markan priority, the Olivet Discourse is one of the earliest layers, and a lot of the Olivet Discourse is the Jewish apocalyptic stuff. So most people like Ehrman and stuff make quite copious use of the Olivet Discourse for this reason. Now it
I
gets, just to
understand
be
it's
clear,
difficult.
sometimes what happens, Drew, in this is you get a lot of circular reasoning because suddenly people are shooting from the hip at what is, quote, early. Right. Well, are
Right.
they deciding what's early based on their framework of Jewish, the Schweitzer framework, or because of other reasons are they deciding?
Yeah,
It's very kind of loosey goosey.
So this is a problem that really does go both ways, in my opinion. Is an interpolation, unless I'm using the term wrong, is when somebody that's of the Schweitzer camp, if you want to call it that, a historian that believes that Jesus was a failed apocalyptic prophet, and that entire narrative that goes with that, all through him getting this verse that we're talking about wrong, and not coming back in 40, within the 40-year generation of the people that were there. All of that, to me, like you were just saying, Bill, it feeds on itself. Like once you have that narrative, you interpret things in that light.
Yep.
And from the flip side, once you have the Christian narrative that Jesus's word cannot be wrong, you have to interpret in that light. So I think it really does go both ways.
Yep.
And it makes it, it's one of the hardest things to me about trying, like, do you say that every verse, except for the ones that the Bible footnotes, maybe this wasn't original, every verse is to be given equal weight? Or do you use some kind of historical, standard to figure out what's more likely to have been original and what might be an interpolation, which
The
again,
latter.
I take to mean
Yeah.
it was added in by a scribe or something. But
I think you do the latter. I mean, I'm completely comfortable with the idea that you have, as a historian, you have to say, well, what were the earliest layers? Can we discern them confidently? Now it gets very shooting from the hip sometimes, but there are some criteria that have been developed that are really helpful. And certainly just noting that Mark is, the arguments are very strong that Mark was first. I actually think it's way more complicated than just saying Mark was first, because I think but I won't go into that. But anyway,
but I think you would agree that even with all of the progress that's been made and the rubrics that people use, the heuristics, I do think that we have to maintain a healthy skepticism that we could ever get this right, because we'll just never know, exactly what was there 2,000 years ago or how it got there. And then of course there's, gospels that were not in the Bible, and probably rightly so, but we just we're dealing with sort of what I would call, at the risk of blasphemy, an imperfect science. And
we are. So, I totally agree with that too. I think as historically speaking, there's a lot I lean a little bit actually more toward agnosticism on a lot of the Christian history stuff. So I don't think you can just go prove all these things happened historically. I think you can demonstrate some things. Yeah. And there are
it's
scholars.
Really important. I know your case for Christianity is a cumulative one, where your faith in God is buoyed by other things he's, it's not just I read this and then when I got to Revelation I believed it all. It's yours is a more robust case than that, and I respect
maybe if you left out the Revelations,
maybe that would help. Actually,
a lot of there are scholars, of course, who take a very extreme agnostic view. That we more or less can only just look at the literary products we have, and we can't hardly conclude anything about the original Jesus. And I'm actually sympathetic to a lot of what they say about that, because that's so true of almost a lot of stuff, but. I do think Ehrman and the Schweitzer camp has a lot that they can argue that, hey, there's good reasons to conclude this is probably part of the original Jesus stuff. And of course, I think he did preach apocalyptically and stuff. It's not like I'm not against that. It's just about how you kind of define different things and where you decide some things are original. Let me just finish out the thing about what I was saying about the Olivet Discourse. You have two parts. You have the what are the signs, okay? And Jesus gets to that. He actually gives a sign. In fact, he literally says, then you will see the sign, like in the first half of the discourse. So he seems clearly be talking about signs. Then there's a point where it flips. And he says, now concerning the day and the hour. And from that point on, all of his discussion is about timing.
Right.
When is this thing going to happen? And so I think that's pretty clear. It's Matthew has made it the clearest by far, but it's also really clear in Mark. And Mark, again, is the priority given usually by historians. You could rely on Mark at least before you just assume Matthew. So this is true in Mark as well as in Matthew, just to be clear. Why is that important? Because when you get to him answering the question about timing, you understand signs are different from timing. Signs are indicating it's getting near. Timing is exactly when it's going to happen. Like, when is it going to happen? And when it comes to the timing, he says, like, this isn't open to interpretation. Everybody agrees what he says. He says nobody knows. Not even he knows when the timing is. Then he gives multiple parables to illustrate this, which all show.
He says day or hour. Like, he's very, like, he doesn't say, because I would push back a little bit on back. They're just, sorry to interrupt, but it says, I don't know the day or the hour, meaning I don't know exactly when it's going to happen, is how I take it. Not.
And he doesn't stop there, right? I mean, he says, I don't know the day or the hour, but I can tell you a few things about the timing.
Yeah.
Well, no, actually, I don't think either of those are quite right. First of all, the question was answering the question he's answering. Just to be clear, is the disciples ask him when will these things be? The language of day and hour is just a common. I don't know. It's a what would you call it? Like a metonymic, if you're familiar with the language. That's the way I would think of it. It's like it's just using the words to talk about timing. Like when you talk about wheels, I have a nice set of wheels, meaning your car, but you're using, this is really common even in the Gospels to use hour and day. Yeah. So that's not, I don't think that's a very good, I don't think that's a very good point.
I would just, sorry to interrupt again, but I would just argue that, like, Bible scholars need to do their job better then, because if day or hour means something different than what it says in English, then write it how it's supposed to write in English. Like, don't give me this thing that I need to translate with, like, a sphere stone and, like, the moons of Jupiter and, like, 400 codexes to, like, work out what's going on. Like, if this is supposed to be like the
but
like,
and
I
would even add that, you know, not only does, even if let's take it as an idiomatic thing, like, I don't know the day or the hour. I don't know.
Yeah.
I know neither the day nor the hour. I know nothing about what time or you know, exactly when, but I do know that even if you read it the way you're reading it, Bill, I do know that the Jewish people won't pass away before it happens. So you know a little something about the timing, because
let me get to that.
People will pass away later. Who knows? But I mean, it's a little bit.
Let me get to that, though. I haven't got to that yet. I'm just trying to say that the discourse has a very clear order to it, and that can be very helpful in reading the whole thing, because knowing that he devotes one whole section to answering the question about signs, and then he devotes the second half to the question of timing. And when he does get to the question of timing, again, it really doesn't matter, actually, the words day and hour, because they use them all the time like that throughout the Gospels. Like, his hour was coming, you know, but it's not just meaning hour. It just means his time is coming. And he's answering the question when. Like, that's just even in the context in English, he's answering the question when. So anyway. And then when he goes on.
But he doesn't just say, I don't know, right?
Well, he says nobody knows, neither the Son, nobody, not angels, nobody knows the timing. Only the God the Father knows the timing. And then he illustrates it with parables, like the guy, that leaves his estate and he disappears for a long time. That could be months, keep in mind. It could be a year. It doesn't matter to me. He's gone for a long time. And he gives this warning, like, they don't know when he's coming back. Like, they don't know when. That's the point. They don't know when. They don't know the timing. And so there's a warning to the disciples that they don't start living as if he's never coming back. You know, they need to be aware they're not going to know the timing. If you, by the way, read like the book of the beginning of Acts, remember the disciples asked Jesus in Acts chapter 1, they say, will you at this time restore the kingdom to Israel? And Jesus says, it's not for you to know the times or the seasons. Now notice he's not using day and hour. but he's using another expression for time. It's not for you to know when God is going to do this. And that's the same thing, it seems to me, that he's saying in the Olivet Discourse. You're not going to know the timing. When Paul writes to the Thessalonians, he affirms this. He never gives a timing for when Jesus might come back. He simply says it's like he's going to come like a thief in the night. And the burden on you, which, by the way, is one of the parables, right, that Jesus uses in the Olivet Discourse, is the thief in the night. And Paul's using it. And he just says, look, you're not going to know the timing. The key is don't fall asleep. Don't get drunk like it's nighttime, and he's never going to come back. You got to live as if it's daytime and he could come at any time. I mean, that's the effect. That, anyway, is what he wrote to the Thessalonians. And then then in 2 Thessalonians, the church there's people in the church that think they're living in the eschaton. They're living through the eschaton. And Paul writes the second letter to say, no, you're not living through the eschaton. And you know how we know that? And then he references the stuff from the Olivet Discourse. That's from Daniel. And
Wait, where's this?
This is in 2 Thessalonians 2. 2 Thessalonians 2. And he says, look, if you're familiar with the little horn from Daniel.
Isn't 2 Thessalonians consensus is a forgery? It's not written by Paul?
No, consensus? No, the majority of scholars think 2 Thessalonians is authentic. But there is a significant minority who don't think it's authentic. But the majority of scholars think it's authentic. But anyway, either by the way, even if you didn't think that, it's still a book from the first century. But anyway, they think the eschaton is going to happen, and Paul, the way he tells them it's not the day of judgment. How do we know it's not the day of judgment? Is because the sign that Jesus referenced hasn't happened. That's what he refers to, is the sign that Jesus gives in the section of the Olivet Discourse from Matthew 24, I think it's verse 15, the sign about the abomination of desolation and the work of the little horn. If you're familiar with Daniel, that's all referencing the stuff from Daniel chapter 7, 8, 9, and 10, those visions in Daniel.
Do you know what section of 2 Thessalonians, sorry?
It's chapter 2. Yep. 2 Thessalonians 2.
Also, by the way, this is the scholar that you said was an idiot. Look at that.
Oh no!
Man.
Please don't show his name.
No. Oh,
please
at
don't
that glorious. No, it's Charles. That the guy I read out that comment.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I probably I did not think you would say put someone's name. Yeah, but I'm just saying.
No. He's like dead for he's been dead for 100 years. Like
yeah, still I don't want to.
Some serious sideburns though.
No, I'm just kidding.
I mean, honestly, those comments were terrible. So I don't know what to say.
So 2 Thessalonians, what verse is it? Sorry,
chapter 2. The whole chapter is about the day of judgment. They think the day of judgment is the day of the Lord has come. And Paul says, no, it's not come. And then he goes on to explain the reference to the man of lawlessness. Yep. Look at verse 5. Don't you remember when I was with you, I used to tell you these things? Okay, you just flipped it up. Right. The secret power of lawlessness is already at work and so on. But look at back up to verse 3 there. Verse 3, yeah, highlight that. Don't let anyone deceive you in any way. That day will not come until the rebellion, that's a reference to Daniel, occurs and the man of lawlessness is revealed, the man doomed to destruction. He will oppose and will exalt himself over everything that is called God or is worshipped. This is what Jesus is referencing in Matthew 24 when he refers to the abomination of desolation. The one who will, according to Mark, will stand in the holy place. So he sets himself up in God's temple. I mean, you can read it for yourself. He's clearly describing somebody.
This is great because the second temple was destroyed in 70 CE. So this would have to be before that, right?
Yeah, prior to it. Yeah. He says, don't you remember that when I was with you, I told you these things? And then he says in verse 8, then the lawless one will be revealed, whom the Lord Jesus will overthrow with the breath of his mouth and destroy by the splendor of his coming. Remember that in the Olivet Discourse, Jesus is coming, which is like verses 20, 28, 29, 30, and so on, that coming is to destroy the ruler who sets up the abomination of desolation in the temple. So Jesus' coming is an answer to that man of lawlessness who is described here in 2 Thessalonians 2. So again, all I'm trying to say is that this passage here has, I guess, is aware, I'm not saying that Matthew was written or Mark was written, but he's aware of the fact that there's this view, let's just say it very generically, among the early Christians, that Jesus taught that this, what we now have is the first half of the Olivet Discourse, that was the sign before Jesus would ever come.
But
okay, when you get to okay,
so I'm just asking, but how does, because if he sets himself up in God's temple, that kind of gives it a hard date to stop, unless you start to interpret the temple to be like the body of God now. You know what I mean?
It's a great question, just to take us on a rabbit trail, but it's a perfectly great question. You know, like that you'd have to then. I agree. I'm just reading what it seems to plainly say, and you can go back and read it and see if you can. Obviously, you can just totally disagree with what I've just said if you want. When you get then to the second half of the discourse, again, it's about timing. So the reason I said that, the reason I was trying to say that, and I actually said I would do that in 60 seconds, like 10 minutes ago. The reason that I was trying to emphasize that is because we're talking about verses 34 and 35. But verses 34 and 35 are the final climactic statement at the end of the first half of that discourse, where he has been talking not about timing, but about the signs. He's not talking about timing in that passage in the first half of that discourse. So it's not till after that he begins to talk about timing. So that's another reason I would just say I might have good reason in English, no Greek, nothing like that, to think maybe Jesus isn't talking about timing in verses 34 and 35, because he's making kind of the final climactic statement of his discussion about the signs. And now we're to Drew's big question, the most important question of all. What's the point of saying any of this? Well, why did he even say Matthew 24, verse 34 and verse 35? And the answer is that he wants to assert the certainty of the signs program he's just laid out that's going to precipitate his coming. Amen, I say to you. Okay, that's Jesus uses that expression when he's about to, give something strong. And it's at the end of the first half of the discourse about signs. And he says, Amen, I say to you. And then he wants to say two things. But they're just twin statements making the same point. Number one, this people, which I read as this faithless brood, will not pass away until all this program has come to fulfillment. And then secondly, the second thing he says, heaven and earth will pass away. My words will never pass away. But notice in verse 35, you don't have to ask me what his point is. His point is about the certainty, right? Heaven and earth will pass away. My words will never pass away. Does that have anything to do with, wait, let me just finish. Does that have anything to do with timing? That has nothing to do with timing. It has to do with him affirming the certainty that what he's just laid out, the program he's just laid out, is absolutely going to happen. And the expression, this, by the way, I did never mention this to you, but the word will be accomplished or fulfilled or take place. That word, that verb is actually a play on words with the word genea. So he says, kind of artfully, Amen, I say to you, this brood will not pass away until everything I've told you is birthed. So the word take place means to come to be, to come into being. So it's the word. It's also the word to be born, like in in classical Greek, you would regularly just translate that word to be born. So he's actually got a little play on words there, because he's saying, like, this group who was born, but they're now faithless and rebellious, they're not going to pass away until the program I've just laid out has been birthed. So it's affirming the certainty of it. And why is that important? Well, because the whole program involves the judgment of the world and the judgment on rebellious Israel, on the faithless and rebellious group. So that's why he's talking about them. He's just spent the whole discussion of signs is laying out that the city is going to be judged at some point.
Is it like Jesus kind of saying in your mind, hey, there's always going to be arseholes. Like these arseholes are always like this, like essentially, is that what you kind of getting at? Like he's essentially saying, like, these people will be with us right up until everything falls apart.
I mean, if you're affirming the certainty of it, it's probably a little bit like saying that it's not going to go unaddressed.
I get the wordplay, I guess, but I still feel like it's an odd statement, right? It's like, it's like saying all the good people will be here until the end, and all the bad people will also be here till the end, and all the blonde-haired people will be here till the end, and all. You can say that about anything. Everything will be here until the end, right?
Well, if you said something like, if you say you were running for office in Mexico, well, I don't want to stereotype a country, in countries that have cartels. Right. Yeah. If you were running for office in a country with a cartel, and you said, well, this cartel will not I guess pass away. I'm trying to think of a better English word, but this cartel will not pass away until justice has been fully realized. It's just a way of saying they ain't going to get away with it. And remember, Matthew 23, that triggers this whole inquiry by the disciples, is Jesus has just spent the whole chapter denouncing the government, the leaders of the government. And that because of the way they're treating the true believers in God, they're going to they've already persecuted them in the past. They're going to persecute the prophets and apostles and stuff I send to them in the future. And they are going to be judged. God is going to judge them for their rebellion. So, I mean, that is the program, right, that is laid out in this whole idea that God, in order for God to restore the nation of Israel and to restore the world, he actually has to do it through judgment, right? It's not like all the Jews are going to perish. Jesus' entire vision is from the Old Testament prophets. The nation of Israel is going to be restored. The disciples are going to are following him in the anticipation that this nation is going to be restored, and they are going to be restored. But in order to accomplish that, there's going to have to be a judgment of the group who has been opposing them and who is going to be persecuting them. I mean, go back to the first half of that sermon. He tells the disciples, by the way, while you carry out the global campaign to reach all the nations of the world, you're going to be severely persecuted. So it's not easy to be persecuted. So I suppose it's helpful to know there is going to be a judgment and people aren't going to get away with it. I mean, maybe that's the connotation of it. I don't know.
I really have enjoyed this conversation, and I think I really wanted to get to the Matthew 16 or Mark 16, the verses that we were initially talking about, the tribulation and stuff. Maybe we need to do a third one. I don't know if this needs to be a third one or we need to continue this conversation another time, but we've only got about 10 more minutes, and I really want to ask you this question, because for me, this is coming back to, I guess, to like what we're talking about before about worldviews. And I start from this worldview where I don't necessarily believe that the Bible is the inherent word of God, or I don't believe it's the inherent word of God. So I've got a kind of a two-part, but my question for you, Bill, is what do you see the Bible as? Are they instructions from God? Was it ordained by God? Like, what is the Bible in your eyes? Because you either have, in my mind, and I'll let you speak, but you either have a history book that's kind of written that you have to like jumble things around, or you have this thing that God has given us to kind of understand him and understand his ideas and his concepts and cultures. And if it's that latter one, I'm just asking, like, why is it so complicated? If God has a message for humanity, why not just tell humanity that message? Why not just beaming into everyone's brain so everyone knows, that, the Exodus happened and all these, like people could be born with the understanding of who God is, like perfectly, if God's all powerful, and then still choose to reject him if they wanted to. All the angels in heaven, a third of the angels did, even though they had full knowledge of who God is. Like, so my understanding is like, why is it so complicated? Why is the Bible, is it, like, in your mind, is it from God, or is it just like a book of ideas written by people about God? Like, what do you think it is?
Yeah, I mean, I take the tradition. I hold to the traditional view of Scripture. My sort of attitude toward it is that I believe Jesus as the Gospels present him, and so I believe he chose the apostles, and they wrote. Not they didn't write everything, but that they were the leaders of the early churches and so on historically, and they were like his spokesman. That's what the word apostle in Greek just means. You're the ambassador of, like, a diplomat for a country, So my view has been, I should probably take my view of the Bible should be cued off of them. So the way in which Jesus understood the scriptures, the way he used the scriptures, the way the apostles and their writings use scripture, I just try to follow that pattern and hold the views they did. So I don't think of it so much as holding to like a creed, so much as just trying to follow their example. And obviously Jesus took these books really seriously from the Old Testament, and so on. So I take them very seriously. Now, as far as simplicity, I really think Jesus is right. This idea that seek and you shall find, that I don't think that most people actually read these books that much, or at least not that closely. So I think they take little bits of them and they kind of get obsessed about certain parts of them. And I'm talking about Christians or non-believers. It really doesn't matter who they are. Very few people, I think, read these books that like actually read them a lot and read them carefully. And part of that is generational. People in the past were readers more. I mean, the people who could read probably read more, and stuff. But part of it is just people are lazy and they do other things, whatever. So I do think when you, like, if you're reading Matthew 24, I don't think just the structure of the sermon is really that complicated. I mean, the disciples have two questions and Jesus clearly answers the two questions in two parts. Like, that's about as simple as it gets. And that can be a nice little guide for understanding kind of what the various parts of the sermon are about. Go ahead.
But is it from God's perspective, like overall, do you think that the Bible has been essentially ordained by God in order to teach us about him? And
yeah, I mean, I agree with the Apostle Paul's statement that the scripture is God breathed. He's referring, of course, to the Old Testament scriptures there, but I believe that they're God breathed. But because that's the word he used, is God breathed. And what does he mean? Well, he clearly is referring to the story when God created Adam, because like that's the famous story where God breathed, is that Adam was just a corpus until God breathed into him life. So the way I understand scriptures is what I think Paul meant, which is that in reading scripture, in reading these words, they're a source of life. They breathe into the people who read it and believe it. It breathes into them the life of God, like God imparts his life to people through these words, through these stories, through these things, as people trust them. Yeah, as people believe them. So because Adam was just a corpus until God breathed his life into him, and once he breathed his life into him, then he had the life of God. So I think that's what Paul means. He just means that in reading these things, people can learn about God and believe him, and then God imparts his life to them. And what we call deliverance or salvation or whatever is just another way to say it.
That's super interesting, because I never thought of it like that, the God breathed thing, because I would almost agree. Like, when I was a Christian, I'd read the Bible and I'd feel that, I guess, life, or, I get the same thing when I read the Bhagavad Gita or other religious texts as well, or non-religious texts, like a book that changed my life is Norwegian Wood by Haruki Murakami, amazing novel. But I mean, well, first of all, thank you both for coming on. My brain is scattered beyond belief. I don't know about
so part 3. So we need a part 3 to discuss the transfiguration and so on. And also you can start by saying, okay, I checked up a couple of things you said and I disagree.
we're originally going to. I was like, oh, it's a bit unfair if I thought I was going to bring on another Christian or something. And I was like, oh, it's a bit of, and then, I don't think you need another Christian in your corner. I think you've like handled this pretty well. So just for everyone, if this is your first time watching Deep Drinks, I invite guests on. We have drinks of their choice. My goal usually on Deep Drinks isn't to push back too hard, but I try to offer the best interpretation or try to understand the person's perspective. I don't necessarily, I don't agree with everything Bill said here for sure, but it's given me so much to think about. Like, I really am going to go away and like think about a lot of what you've said here, because it might be convincing to me when I look further into it. It's very interesting.
And I guarantee you, Drew will have much to say to me. If we do a part 3, he will already have come back to me. Believe me, he is really good at picking apart arguments.
Yeah, well, I think you almost need to build like a syllogism, and I think that this video, for those watching it on the YouTube channel, this video was originally streamed to just the Patreon and channel members. If you want to become a patron or channel member, patreon.com/deepdrinks. But maybe the next one we can. I don't know if anyone in the crowd has a different opinion or wants to maybe jump in. I don't know. We can work something out, but it'd be. This conversation, I think, is interesting. Let me know what you think in the comments. But thank you guys again for coming out. And Bill, great job at defending, I think, your perspective. There's lots for me to kind of unpack and to think about over the next few days. But
just real quick on the other side, it's really helpful, if I just may say, to Christians, if there are Christians that listen to this, the Christians need to also go and get an Ehrman book, his book on Jesus, Jewish apocalyptic prophet, and read it and think about it. And because it's not like everything he says is wrong. And I think he offers some helpful correctives to some things that Christians occasionally get wrong too.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, I love religion. I love studying religion. It's super interesting to have these conversations, and I agree. And I actually love having people on that aren't from the, I guess, atheist sphere of influence and all have the same talking points. So it's interesting to be challenged, and I'm sure there's going to be a lot of comments going, Bill doesn't know what he's talking about, blah, 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 blah. So, let's look forward to that as well. But everyone remember to be polite. Shocking if that would happen. Yeah. And I'm sure, and I hope there's some comments about me on your conversation. But anyway, you have a YouTube channel as well as the podcast, The Divide. Links in the description. My episode will be released by the time you see this on my YouTube channel, so go check it out. Thank you so much, Drew, for coming on, and thank you so much, Bill, for coming on. It's been an absolute pleasure, and we'll have to do this again sometime.
Thanks, David.
Great. Thanks, David.